He didn't hesitate. Victor Hayes planted both hands flat against her back and shoved hard, sending Commander Sarah Mitchell face first into the mud pit while 30 men watched and laughed. Cell phones were already out before she even hit the ground. The video spread in minutes. Everyone thought they'd just seen proof that she didn't belong. Nobody realized they just handed her the weapon she needed. Before we go further, if this story already has your blood boiling, hit subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this goes. Now let's start from the beginning. She walked through the gate at Camp Pendleton on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a single green duffel bag over one shoulder, wearing no rank on her jacket, speaking to no one, drawing no attention to herself. That was the first thing people got wrong about her. They assumed that because she wasn't announcing herself, she had nothing worth announcing. Commander Sarah Mitchell was 43 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed 132 pounds. She had brown eyes that didn't blink as much as most people's eyes did, in a way of standing perfectly still that some people found calming and other people found deeply unsettling, depending on which side of her they happened to be standing on. She had been a Navy SEAL for 18 years. She had deployed to 6 combat zones. She had led 4 direct action missions that were still classified at the highest level. She had been shot twice, once in the left shoulder and once in the right thigh, and on both occasions, she had finished the mission before allowing anyone to treat the wounds. She had trained with the most elite operators in the world. She had buried 2 members of her team. She had saved the lives of 11 others. None of that was written on her face. None of it showed in the way she walked. And that morning at Camp Pendleton, standing in the parking lot outside the main training facility for the new Joint Navy-Marine Combat Program, not a single person who looked at her understood what they were looking at. That was also, as it would turn out, entirely her intention. The joint program had been controversial from the moment it was announced. The idea was simple enough on paper: take the best combat operators from both branches, put them through a unified, advanced training cycle, identify gaps in joint operational capability, and build the kind of cross-branch expertise that modern warfare increasingly demanded. The idea in practice was something considerably more complicated, because Marines and SEALs did not, as a general cultural rule, enjoy being told they had anything to learn from each other. The program needed a commander who could navigate that tension, someone who had credibility with both communities, someone who could hold the line when things got difficult, someone who understood that the point wasn't to pick a winner between the 2 branches, but to make both of them better. Military leadership had chosen Sarah Mitchell. Some people said it was because she was the most qualified person for the job, which was true. Others said it was because her record was so extraordinary that even the most resistant participants would eventually have to respect it, which was also true. And a few people, speaking in the kind of low voice that people use when they want to say something they know is wrong, but plan to say it anyway, suggested that she had been chosen because having a woman in command of a high-profile joint program looked good in front of Congress. That last opinion found its way to Camp Pendleton before Sarah did. She heard about it on her second hour on the base, delivered to her indirectly by a logistics officer named Corporal Dawes, who was trying to be helpful and succeeded only in being honest. Commander Corporal Dawes said, falling into step beside her as she walked toward the administrative building, "I just want you to know that not everybody here is, most people are looking forward to working with you, but there are a few who are a little skeptical," Sarah said. Corporal Dawes looked relieved that she'd said it first. "Yes, ma'am, skeptical. How many is a few?" Dawes hesitated. "More than a few, honestly." Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't look troubled by this. She didn't look anything in particular. She just kept walking. "Who's leading it?" she asked. Dawes blinked. "Leading what?" "The skepticism," Sarah said. "There's always someone leading it. Who is it?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, ma'am. Victor Hayes. He's been with the program since the planning phase. Some people were expecting the command to go to someone with a different profile," Sarah said. "Yes, ma'am. What do you know about him?" Dawes straightened slightly. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes is 30 years Marine Corps, 3 combat deployments to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, decorated, expert in urban combat and counterinsurgency. He's very well respected. The Marines here listen to him." "I'm sure they do," Sarah said. "And the SEALs. He's been working on that, Dawes said, which told Sarah everything she needed to know. She thanked Corporal Dawes and walked the rest of the way to the administrative building alone. She had met Victor Hayes' type before. Not his specific version, not the particular combination of gifts and grievances that made him who he was, but the type. The decorated veteran who had given everything to the realm and genuinely believed that his sacrifice entitled him to a say in who was allowed to stand beside him. The man who had earned his authority through 30 years of blood and mud, and who could not tolerate the idea that a woman half his size might be placed above him, not because she hadn't worked for it, not because she hadn't bled for it, but simply because something in the architecture of his worldview could not accommodate the fact that excellence did not recognize gender. She had met that type. She had outworked that type. She had outlasted that type. She was not afraid of Victor Hayes, but she was paying attention to him. That was the most important thing. That was the thing that nobody who underestimated Sarah Mitchell ever realized until it was far too late. She was always paying attention. The first full assembly of the joint program took place the following morning at 6 a.m. in the main briefing room. 47 participants, 23 Navy SEALs, and 24 Marine Raiders arranged themselves in rows of chairs with a precision that would have looked to a civilian like simple military orderliness. But Sarah, standing at the front of the room and watching them file in, read the seating pattern the way a chess player reads the board. The SEALs clustered on the left side of the room. The Marines took the right. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way the Marines arranged themselves around a single point in the third row from the back on the right-hand side. They positioned themselves relative to that point the way iron filings position themselves relative to a magnet, not consciously, not deliberately, but unmistakably. Victor Hayes sat in that third row seat like a man who had already decided the outcome of every meeting he would ever attend. He was a large man, 6 feet 2, 230 pounds of muscle that had been built up and maintained over 3 decades of relentless physical discipline. He had a gray crew cut and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from a material slightly harder than the human face normally allowed. His eyes were dark and absolutely level, and he was looking at Sarah with an expression that wasn't quite contempt. It was something slightly different. It was the expression of a man who has decided in advance that something is inadequate and is simply waiting for the world to confirm what he already knows. Sarah looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the room. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Commander Mitchell. I will be running this program. I want to tell you 3 things before we begin." The room was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of an attentive audience, the tight, controlled quiet of people deciding whether or not to accept what they were seeing. "First," Sarah said, "I don't care what branch you're from. I don't care about your previous deployments, your medals, or your reputation. I care about performance. I care about what you can do here in this program, on these courses under these conditions. That is the only currency that matters in my program." She paused. Let it land. "Second, this program will be harder than what you expect. Not because I'm trying to prove something, because the operational environments you will face are harder than what most of you have experienced, and my job is to make sure you are ready for them. I will not apologize for demanding your best." Another pause. "Third, I run this program, not by rank alone, by results. The moment I stop performing at the standard I set for you, you will have the right to question my authority. Until that moment, I expect your cooperation and your effort." She looked around the room. 47 faces, some interested, some neutral, some, and she counted them without making it obvious she was counting 11 faces that were very carefully expressionless in the way that people are expressionless when they have already made a private decision. Victor Hayes' face was the most carefully expressionless of all. "Any questions?" Sarah said. Nobody spoke. "Good," she said. "We start in 20 minutes. Full gear." The obstacle course at Camp Pendleton was not designed for the faint of heart. It was a 2-mile circuit of walls, water crossings, rope, climbs, crawl sections, and terrain elements that tested every major physical and mental system simultaneously. Most participants completed the initial run in somewhere between 18 and 22 minutes. Elite operators could push it under 16. Sarah Mitchell ran it in 14 minutes and 8 seconds. She ran it first alone before the group ran it. She made no announcement. She simply told them to watch, then ran. When she finished, she wasn't gasping. She was breathing hard. Anyone would be breathing hard, but she was already talking before her heart rate had fully recovered, walking the group through what they would be doing and what she would be looking for. There was a silence that moved through the group when she finished running that course. It was a specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when people have been anticipating one thing and receive something completely different, the kind that requires a moment of recalibration. Victor Hayes did not recalibrate. Sarah watched him watch her run. She watched his jaw tighten when her time was announced. She watched him look away, then look back, then turn and say something under his breath to the Marine standing next to him. The Marine, a younger man, solid build name tag reading Kowalski, listened, nodded, and did not look entirely comfortable with what he was hearing. That told her something too. Victor's voice reached her as the group lined up for their own run. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the men around him in a volume that was just barely loud enough to carry, which meant it was entirely deliberate. 14 minutes, he said, on a fresh course with everyone watching. I can run that in my sleep. These courses are designed for operators, not track meets. A few men laughed. A few more didn't. What do you think, Kowalski? Victor said. Kowalski looked at the course, looked at Sarah, who was standing 15 yards away with her back partially turned. I think I need to run faster than 14 minutes, Gunny, he said quietly. Victor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something that looked like the recognition of a small tactical defeat. He had expected Kowalski to validate him. Kowalski had chosen to point the compass somewhere else. Sarah noted it, said nothing. She never said anything. Not yet. That was the strategy, and it required a discipline that most people could not have maintained, because it wasn't passive. It wasn't acceptance. Every morning for the first 2 weeks of the program, Victor Hayes chipped away at her authority in ways that were carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold of formal insubordination. He questioned her decisions in front of the group, not with open defiance, he was too experienced for that, but with the particular technique of the experienced underminer. He would ask questions that implied incompetence. He would reference his own experience in ways that implicitly contrasted it with hers. He would position himself physically in ways that suggested parallel authority rather than subordination. Commander, with respect, in Fallujah, we found that, Commander, I've run programs like this before, and the standard approach to this scenario is, Commander, my Marines have trained in this environment extensively. Maybe I could address this particular element. And Sarah would listen. She would acknowledge his experience. She would sometimes, not always, but sometimes incorporate his feedback when it was operationally sound. And she would never not once give him the confrontation he was trying to provoke. Because the confrontation was what he wanted. He wanted her angry. He wanted her defensive. He wanted her to give him something he could point to and say, there you see, she can't handle it. She gave him nothing. What she gave him instead was performance. Every morning, 6 a.m., she was there before any of them. Every course, every exercise, every tactical problem, she went first, she went harder, she went better. Her decisions under simulated pressure were faster and more accurate than anyone expected from someone who supposedly didn't belong there. Her knowledge of cross-branch operations was deeper than most of the instructors. Her ability to read a team's emotional state and adjust her approach in real time was extraordinary, something that even the most resistant participants began to notice, even if they didn't want to admit it. The program was running well. By any measurable standard, it was running exceptionally well. And Victor Hayes could not stand it. She knew this not because he told her he would never tell her, but because she was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. She watched the shift that happened in him as the weeks went by, the frustrated confusion of a man whose predictions kept failing to materialize. He had expected her to fold under pressure. She didn't fold. He had expected her to make visible tactical errors. She didn't make them. He had expected the SEALs to quietly align with his skepticism once they'd seen her in action. They didn't. Slowly, quietly, with a dignity that made the whole thing more irritating rather than less, she was winning. And winning was not what Victor had planned for her. He stopped being merely dismissive. He started being something sharper, more targeted. The questions he asked in group settings became more pointed. The incidents he staged, and they were staged, Sarah had no doubt about that, became more visible. He argued a tactical point with her in front of the whole group during a debrief session, One Thursday evening, standing his ground with such force that 3 Marines physically leaned forward in their seats, waiting to see if she would crack. She didn't crack. She heard his argument, acknowledged the experience behind it, explained her decision, and moved on. Clean, controlled, immovable. Later that night, Corporal Dawes found her in the equipment room and said very quietly, "Commander, people are starting to talk about Hayes differently. Some of them are." He stopped, regrouped. "Some of them think he's going too far." Sarah looked up from the gear she was checking. "Some of them," she said, "more than some." "Good," she said. "Let them think." Dawes blinked. "Ma'am?" "When people start noticing on their own," Sarah said, turning back to her gear, "it means something. It means the picture is becoming clear. You can't tell people what to see. They have to see it themselves." Dawes stood there for a moment, clearly turning this over. Then he said, "Hayes is planning something, Commander. I don't know what, but he's talking to people privately." The energy has changed. Sarah nodded once, set down the gear, looked at Dawes with those calm, unblinking eyes. "I know," she said. "You know, I've known for 4 days," she said. "I'm waiting." Dawes stared at her. "Waiting for what, Commander?" She picked up the gear again. "For him to show me exactly where he's going." It happened on a Wednesday morning during a field exercise near the training trenches on the eastern side of the course. The exercise involved a sequential obstacle scenario, team members navigating a muddy trench system, while instructors assessed form decision-making and recovery speed under simulated stress conditions. It was cold. It had rained the night before and the ground was saturated, and the trench walls were slick, and the mud at the bottom was thick and dark and smelled of wet earth and physical effort. 19 people were present, 4 SEALs, 12 Marines, 2 instructors, and a visiting training evaluator from Naval Special Warfare Command who had arrived that morning unannounced. The visiting evaluator made Sarah pause internally for just a moment. An unannounced evaluation. The timing was interesting. She filed it away. She was standing at the edge of the first trench section, 2 steps from the edge, giving the group a technical briefing on the recovery and advanced sequence they would be practicing. She was in the middle of a sentence. She was facing forward. She had her back to a section of the group that included Victor Hayes. And then Victor Hayes stepped forward and shoved her with both hands flat against her back, with his full body weight behind it. She went forward and down into the trench and hit the mud face first. For a half second, there was total silence. Then someone laughed. 1 person, and then 3 people, and then the laughter was spreading through the group the way that kind of ugly laughter spreads. Not because it's genuinely funny, because it isn't, but because laughing feels safer than not laughing. Because laughing is a way of declaring which side you're on. And in that moment, standing there with mud on their boots, 12 out of 19 people there chose to declare their side. The visiting evaluator from Naval Special Warfare Command did not laugh. He stood very still and watched. Sarah lay in the mud for exactly the length of time it took her to process what had happened and formulate the exact appropriate response. It was not a long time. It was perhaps 3 seconds. Then she pushed herself up with both arms stood and turned around. She was covered in mud. Her face was dark with it. Her hair was flat against her head. She looked at Victor Hayes, who was standing at the edge of the trench with his arms loose at his sides, and an expression on his face that she could not fully read. Part satisfaction, part something else, something more uncertain, something that might have been the first dim recognition that he had miscalculated. She looked at him for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned away, climbed out of the trench on the opposite side, and without a single word to anyone picked up where her briefing had left off. The laughter stopped. Not because anyone told it to stop, because something in the silence that followed her standing up and continuing was more powerful than any response she could have given. The people who had laughed looked at each other. The people who hadn't laughed looked at the people who had. The visiting evaluator from Naval Special Warfare Command wrote something in his notebook. Victor Hayes watched her continue the briefing. He had expected tears. He had expected fury. He had expected her to crack open right there in the mud in front of 19 witnesses and prove everything he'd been telling everyone for weeks. She had given him silence. She had given him calm. She had given him the image of a woman covered in mud who stood up and kept going. That image Victor Hayes did not yet realize was the most dangerous thing anyone had ever given him. By that evening, the videos had spread across the base. The cell phone footage shot by two different phones, one Marine and one SEAL, showed everything in stark clarity. Sarah falling forward, the sound of laughter, and then Sarah standing up and continuing. Standing up covered in mud in front of 19 people, and the only thing on her face being concentration. People watched the videos and felt things they hadn't expected to feel. The people who had laughed at the time felt something shifting uncomfortably in their chests when they saw it replayed. The people who hadn't laughed felt something sharper, something that moved quickly toward anger. The visiting evaluator from Naval Special Warfare Command watched the video 3 times on his phone in his temporary quarters, then made a phone call. And Sarah Mitchell went back to her room, cleaned the mud off her face and her hair, sat down at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote one line at the top of a fresh page. The line was not about Victor Hayes. It was not about the shove. It was not about the laughter or the mud or the videos or any of the things that had happened that morning. The line was a single question. And the question was, what does a man who believes he is invincible always do next? She knew the answer. She had always known the answer. Men who believe they are invincible always volunteer for the thing that's supposed to prove it. She closed the notebook, set it on the desk, looked at the wall for a moment with those calm, unblinking eyes. Then she picked up her pen and began to write the training request that would set the next thing in motion. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't even precisely calculating in the cold, transactional way that word usually implies. She was patient. She was patient the way that only someone who has been genuinely tested understands patience, not as waiting, not as enduring, but as the active and deliberate accumulation of truth. She had 30 years of truth on her side. She had performance in record, in a visiting naval evaluator, in 19 witnesses, in 2 cell phone videos, and the image of herself standing up out of the mud and continuing. She had everything she needed. Now she was going to use it, not to destroy him, to teach him. Whether he was willing to learn was at this point entirely his own choice to make. The training request landed on the base commander's desk at 7:14 the following morning. It was a single page, cleanly written, formally structured, requesting authorization for a close quarters combat demonstration as part of the joint program's tactical assessment curriculum. The request cited 3 specific training objectives. It named no individuals. It expressed no grievance. It read to anyone who picked it up without context, like routine administrative paperwork generated by a program running exactly as planned. Colonel James Whitfield read it twice. He was a careful man, 48 years old, with 26 years of command experience and a talent for reading what was behind a document rather than what was on it. He read the request a second time, set it down, and looked out his window for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the visiting evaluator from Naval Special Warfare Command. "Did you see the video?" Whitfield asked without greeting. "3 times, said the evaluator. His name was Commander Trent Okafor, and he had a voice like gravel shifting in a metal drum. And the request she filed this morning..." A pause. "I saw it." "What do you think?" Whitfield said. "I think," Okafor said slowly, "that Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes has no idea what he's walked into." Whitfield looked at the request again. "She hasn't named him." "She doesn't need to," Okafor said. "He'll name himself." Whitfield approved the request at 7:41. He signed it without adding conditions, without flagging it for review, and without telling anyone outside his immediate staff that he had done so. Some things in his experience needed room to develop without interference. Sarah received the approval notification at 8:03. She was in the middle of her morning run. She read the notification on her phone, put the phone back in her pocket, and kept running. Her pace did not change. 2 miles later, back in her quarters, she sat down and began to plan. Not the demonstration itself. She had planned that 2 days ago in her head, in the quiet hours before sleep, running through every scenario, every variable, every possible way it could go wrong, and every adjustment she would make if it did. No, what she was planning now was something more precise. She was planning the sequence, the order of events, the way you build a demonstration that teaches something so clearly, so undeniably, that the lesson cannot be argued with afterward. Because that was the point. Not to win a fight. Anyone could win a fight. She had won plenty of fights. The point was to build something that would last longer than a single afternoon in a training warehouse. The point was to create a moment that would attach itself to the memory of everyone who witnessed it and stay there, changing the shape of what they believed for the rest of their careers. That was a different kind of skill, and it required a different kind of preparation. She was still at her desk when Corporal Dawes knocked at her door at 9:15. "Commander," he said, stepping inside, "the word is getting around about the approval." "Already," she said. It wasn't a question. "Hayes knows," Dawes said. He looked uncomfortable. He had the expression of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to deliver. "He's commander. He's telling people this is your way of trying to formally discipline him without going through channels. He's framing it as retaliation." Sarah set down her pen. "And what are people saying about that?" Dawes hesitated. "Mixed. Some of the Marines think—" He stopped, started again. "Some people think you should have just filed a formal complaint instead of doing this. And the SEALs—" "The SEALs," Dawes said carefully, "are mostly quiet." "Quiet is different from neutral," Sarah said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think, Dawes?" He blinked clearly, not expecting the question. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet because she genuinely wanted to know what he thought. Not because she needed validation, but because the opinion of a young corporal who had been watching everything unfold from 3 feet away was the kind of ground-level data that commanders who lost their programs usually didn't bother collecting. "I think," Dawes said it finally, "that you're not doing what any of them think you're doing. And I think that's exactly why it's going to work." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, turned back to her desk and said, "Close the door on your way out." By noon, Victor Hayes had voluntarily told 4 separate people that he intended to participate in the demonstration. He hadn't been asked. He hadn't been assigned. He had simply begun asserting in the casual, confidently loud way of a man who has spent 30 years being the largest and most experienced person in most rooms that he was going to be involved. "She wants to run a demo," he said to Sergeant First Class Dominguez over lunch, his voice carrying across 2 tables without effort. "Fine, I'll run the demo. I've been doing CQC instruction since she was in high school." Dominguez, a quiet Marine with careful eyes, ate a spoonful of soup and said nothing. "This is what she does," Victor continued. "When they can't beat you straight on, they go around, file paperwork, stage events, make it look like a training exercise when really it's just—" "Gunny," Dominguez said. Victor looked at him. "You shoved her," Dominguez said, "in front of witnesses, with cameras." Victor's jaw tightened. "That was a training." "It wasn't," Dominguez said simply and with no heat at all. "We both know it wasn't." He took another spoonful of soup. "I'd be careful about the demo, Gunny. I really would." Victor stared at him for a moment. Then he looked away, but he didn't change his mind. That was the thing about Victor Hayes that was both his greatest strength and his most reliable weakness. He could hear the truth and simply decide not to let it apply to him. 3 decades of being right about most things had built in him a resistance to the possibility that he might be wrong about any particular thing, and that resistance was strongest precisely when the evidence against him was most clear. A smaller ego would have felt the warning in Dominguez's words and recalibrated. Victor's ego felt the warning and doubled down. He told a 5th person he was participating, then a 6th. By the time the afternoon briefing session started, his participation in the upcoming demonstration had become, in the informal economy of base conversation, a settled and established fact. Sarah heard about it through Dawes at 2:15. She was reviewing training logs when he knocked. "He volunteered himself," Dawes said, loudly. "Good," she said without looking up. "Commander, do you want me to, should I draft a formal assignment? Make it official." "No," she said. "Let him keep volunteering. Let him own it." She turned a page. "When did he start telling people? Around 11:30? Lunchtime?" She nodded. "How many people know by now?" "Most of the program participants, some of the base staff. The evaluator knows." She set the log down. "And the mood?" Dawes thought about it. Tense, but different from before. Before, the tension was mostly about whether people accepted your authority. Now it's more like, he searched for the word, anticipation. "Good," she said again, and that was all she said. The videos from the trench incident were still circulating. They had moved beyond the base by the second day, onto personal social media accounts, into group chats spreading through the invisible networks of military families and veterans and people who had served and people who followed those who had served. The comments were exactly what you would expect them to be, which is to say they were a near-perfect cross-section of the American character. Generous and ugly and defensive and passionate and wrong and right and everything in between. Some comments said she shouldn't have been there in the first place. Some said Hayes should be court-martialed. Some questioned her decision not to respond immediately. Some praised it. A veterans advocacy group posted the video with a caption that generated 14,000 shares in 36 hours. A retired Marine general commented publicly that what Hayes had done was a disgrace to the uniform, and his comment generated responses that ran for 240 replies. Sarah did not look at the videos. She did not read the comments. She did not know the specific numbers. 14,000 shares, 240 replies, and she would not have found them particularly significant if she had. What happened online was not the thing. The thing was here on the base in this program, in the 47 people she was responsible for. The internet could say what it wanted. The internet always said what it wanted. The question was, what happened next in this room with these people who were all now living inside the tension of an unresolved moment, waiting to find out what it meant? She was going to tell them what it meant. On Thursday morning, 4 days after the trench incident, she called the program together at 7 a.m., full assembly. All 47 participants, the two senior instructors, Commander Okafor from Naval Special Warfare and Colonel Whitfield, who arrived quietly and stood at the back without fanfare. She stood at the front and waited until the room was completely still. "We're going to talk about what happened Monday," she said. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system running. "Not because I want to revisit it," she continued, "and not because I'm asking anyone to take sides. We're going to talk about it because it is directly relevant to what this program exists to teach." She let that sit for a moment. "In a combat environment," she said, "you will encounter situations where your expectations about another person are wrong, where the individual standing next to you or across from you has capabilities that your assumptions told you they shouldn't have. When that disconnect happens in the field, people die. Not because the person was inadequate, because the assessment of that person was inadequate." She looked around the room. She moved her gaze deliberately, not rushing it, making contact with faces, letting people know she was speaking to them specifically. "Every assumption you carry about what a leader should look like, what a soldier should look like, what strength looks like, every one of those assumptions is a liability. It is a weight you carry that your enemy does not carry. And in my program, we are going to work on putting that weight down." Victor Hayes was in his usual seat, third row, right side. He was watching her with an expression that had gone through several changes since she started speaking and was now somewhere in the territory of careful neutrality. He was a smart man. He understood what she was doing. He understood the elegance of it, addressing the incident not as a personal grievance, but as a tactical lesson, making it impossible to dismiss as emotional or self-serving. He understood all of that. He still didn't believe she could beat him in front of everyone. That was the thing Sarah had understood about him from the very beginning. Intelligence and belief are different systems. You can understand something completely and still not believe it. "The close quarters demonstration I have requested," she said, "will take place Saturday morning. The purpose is to illustrate specific counter-response techniques in a controlled setting. Participation is voluntary for demonstration purposes, though observation is mandatory for all program members." She paused. "I'm aware that Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes has expressed interest in participating." The room shifted. You could feel it, a physical collective shift, like a change in air pressure. Victor Hayes sat up slightly straighter. "I want to say clearly," Sarah said, "that his participation, if he chooses it, is welcome. His experience is significant. A demonstration partner with his background will make the training more instructive, not less." It was so precisely calibrated that it took a moment for people to understand what had just happened. She had taken his voluntary self-nomination, which he had made as a challenge, as a flexing of position, as a way of making himself central to an event designed around her, and she had absorbed it. She had made it cooperative. She had made it gracious. She had made it, in the space of 2 sentences, look like exactly what she wanted. Victor Hayes could not object to being welcome. He could not reframe graciousness as an attack. He could not, without looking like exactly the thing he was trying not to look like, back out now. He was in. He was in, and he had put himself there. And Sarah Mitchell had simply held the door open and smiled. After the assembly dismissed, she was stopped on her way out by Okafor. "That was well done," he said quietly, falling into step beside her. "It was straightforward," she said. "No," Okafor said. "It wasn't." He glanced at her sideways. "You've been building this for 2 weeks." She didn't confirm or deny it. She kept walking. "The review board will want a report," Okafor said, "on the incident, on Hayes's conduct, on the program." "I know," she said. "What are you going to recommend?" She was quiet for 3 steps. "That depends on Saturday," she said. Okafor nodded slowly as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. He peeled off at the next quarter. She kept walking. That evening, for the first time since the program had started, a small group of Marines sought her out voluntarily. They were not the most senior Marines in the program. They were younger, mid-rank, late 20s, early 30s. 4 of them standing outside the equipment room when she came out after her evening gear check. The one who spoke was named Reyes. Sergeant Reyes. He had a young face and old eyes, and he stood at a careful parade rest that suggested he wasn't sure whether this was appropriate, but had decided to do it anyway. "Commander," he said, we wanted you to know that." He stopped, regrouped. "What happened on Monday was wrong, and there are more of us who think that than Hayes knows." Sarah looked at him, looked at the 3 behind him. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. Some of us have been going along because." Reyes stopped again, shook his head. "That's not good enough. That's not an excuse." "No," Sarah said quietly. "It isn't, but you're here now." She looked at all 4 of them. "That matters." Reyes nodded, looked down at his boots briefly, the way young people do when something lands heavier than they expected. Then he looked back up. "What's going to happen Saturday, Commander?" She considered him for a moment. This was not a casual question. It was the question of a young man trying to figure out what kind of story he was standing inside, which side of history he was about to find himself on. "What's supposed to happen," she said, "is that people learn something." Reyes held her gaze. "And what's actually going to happen?" The smallest possible suggestion of something peered at the corner of Sarah Mitchell's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough. "The same thing," she said. She left them standing there in the corridor and went back to her quarters and sat at her desk and did not open her notebook and did not write anything. She sat in the quiet for 10 minutes thinking about the 4 young Marines who had come to find her, thinking about Dominguez's carefully placed words at the lunch table, thinking about Kowalski redirecting his compass on the first morning, thinking about all the small, quiet, invisible movements that had been happening in the margins of this program while the main event consumed everyone's attention. This was the thing that most people never understood about the work she did. The loud moments, the shove, the mud, the laughter, the viral video. Those were the moments everyone remembered. But the real work happened in the spaces between the loud moments. The real work was the slow, patient accumulation of 100 small truths that eventually became impossible to deny. The real work was 4 young Marines standing at parade rest in a corridor at 8 o'clock at night because something in them refused to let the wrong thing go unchallenged any longer. Saturday was 5 days away. Victor Hayes was spending those 5 days preparing to prove what he already believed. He was training. He was conditioning. He was running extra sessions in the weight room and reviewing CQ technique videos and telling anyone who would listen that he had been doing this since before Sarah Mitchell graduated from high school, and that size and strength and 30 years of experience were not things that a training demonstration could simulate away. All of that was true, and none of it was the point. Sarah spent those 5 days doing something different. She was not training for a fight. She had been training for a fight for 25 years, and the training was already done. What she was doing in those 5 days was something more deliberate and more precise. She was designing, she was constructing with the careful architectural attention of someone who understands that the structure of an event shapes what people take away from it. A demonstration that would move through a specific sequence toward a specific moment and then let that moment speak entirely for itself. She would not explain herself during it. She would not argue. She would not make speeches or deliver verdicts or tell anyone what to think about what they were seeing. She would simply show them. And then she would let the thing that they saw become the thing that they carried with them for the rest of their careers in the field, in the moments when it mattered, in the decisions they made about who they trusted and who they followed and what they believed real strength was supposed to look like. Friday night, she slept 6 hours, not 8, not 5, 6, which was her operational standard, the number her body had learned to use efficiently across 18 years of working in conditions that did not accommodate luxury. She woke at 5, ran 4 miles in the dark, came back, showered, ate, and sat at her desk until it was time to go. She didn't write anything. She didn't review anything. She had done all of that. There was nothing left to prepare. There was only Saturday morning, the warehouse, the witnesses, the mat, and the lesson that Victor Hayes, for 30 years of excellence and 22 days of certainty, was about to receive, whether he was ready for it or not. Saturday arrived the way significant mornings always do, quietly, without announcement, without any external signal that what was about to happen would matter beyond the ordinary run of days. The base woke up at its usual time. The mess hall served the usual breakfast. The usual sounds of a military installation moving through its morning routine filled the air the usual way. But inside the joint program, nothing felt usual. By 6:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before the demonstration was scheduled to begin, people were already gathering near the main training warehouse. Not because they had been told to, because word had traveled the way word travels in a closed community where everyone is paying attention to the same unresolved tension, invisibly, instantly, completely. SEALs who had no formal obligation to be there were drifting toward the building. Marines who had finished their morning PT were not dispersing the way they normally would. Even base staff who had no connection to the joint program were finding reasons to be in that part of the installation. Corporal Dawes counted 83 people by 7 o'clock. By 7:30, the number was over 100. By the time 8 o'clock arrived and the demonstration was officially scheduled to begin, the warehouse held 117 people, including Colonel Whitfield, Commander Okafor, 2 additional officers from Naval Special Warfare Command who had arrived late Friday night without explanation, and a senior Marine general named Brigadier General Lawrence Holt, who had not been on anyone's expected attendance list and whose presence sent a visible ripple of adjustment through every Marine in the building the moment he walked in. Victor Hayes saw the general walk in. Something changed in his face. It was subtle, the kind of change that only someone watching carefully would catch. A slight tightening around the eyes. A recalibration happening beneath the surface. He had expected this to be a training demonstration in front of the program participants. He had expected it to be the kind of contained internal event that would be observed by the people who already knew the story and would end without formal consequence regardless of the outcome. The presence of a brigadier general changed the geometry of that expectation considerably. He looked across the warehouse at Sarah. She was standing near the center mat talking quietly with one of the instructors. She was in her training uniform, no rank displayed, no indication of anything exceptional about the morning. She had not looked in his direction since he arrived. She was not performing calm. She was calm, which was an entirely different thing and considerably more difficult to counter. He looked back at his general. Holt was speaking with Okafor in a low voice, nodding occasionally, his expression giving away nothing. Victor had served under Holt in his second deployment. He knew the general's face well. He could not read it now. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Sergeant Reyes appeared at his elbow. "You good gunny?" Reyes asked quietly enough that no one else could hear. Victor looked at him. "Why wouldn't I be?" Reyes held his gaze for a beat. "General Holt," he said simply. "I know Holt." "Then you know he doesn't come to routine training demos." A pause. Victor shifted his weight. "This is routine." Reyes said nothing. His silence said it for him. "Fall in with the others," Victor said. His voice came out harder than he intended it to. Reyes fell in with the others. Sarah had in fact known about General Holt since Thursday evening. Okafor had called her, not to warn her, not to ask permission. He had called to tell her that Holt had requested to attend and to ask if she had any objection. She had said no. What she did not say and did not need to say was that Holt's presence was not a complication. It was a gift. Not because she needed the authority his presence conferred. She had her own authority and had been demonstrating it for 3 weeks. But because the lesson she was trying to teach needed witnesses who would carry it beyond this warehouse, beyond this program, beyond this particular conflict between 2 people who represented something much larger than themselves. Holt would carry it. Okafor would carry it. The 2 officers from Naval Special Warfare Command would carry it. Every person in this building today was a vessel for what was about to happen. She had designed this demonstration precisely for that. At 8:02, she walked to the center of the mat and waited. The room settled into silence faster than any room that size should have been able to settle. 117 people, and the silence came down like a blade. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice carried without effort. "This demonstration will cover three core principles of close quarters combat response: force redirection, momentum capture, and positional control under physical disadvantage." She paused, letting those three concepts land. The objective is not to showcase individual skill. The objective is to illustrate why physical size and initial force advantage do not determine outcome in a trained engagement. This is one of the most consistently misunderstood principles in hand-to-hand combat instruction, and it has direct operational implications for every branch represented in this room. Several people in the audience shifted, not restlessly, attentively. The framing was clean and professional and gave everyone in the room a legitimate reason to be watching that had nothing to do with the personal history between the two people who were about to step onto the mat. That was also entirely deliberate. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes," she said, "has graciously agreed to serve as my demonstration partner today. His experience and his physical profile make him an ideal partner for illustrating these principles. I want to acknowledge that publicly and thank him for his participation." 117 people looked at Victor Hayes. He stood up from his seat in the second row. He was large and composed, and he walked to the mat with the unhurried stride of a man who had spent 30 years being the most experienced person in most rooms. He stood across from Sarah and looked at her with those level, dark eyes, and she looked back at him, and for a moment the two of them simply existed in the same space with everything that had happened between them and around them, hovering in the air without being spoken. "Gunny," she said quietly just to him. "Commander," he said, matching her tone. Something passed between them in that exchange. Not warmth, not hostility. Something more complex than either of those, the recognition that two people who have been in genuine conflict are now standing in a place where the conflict will be resolved, and that resolution has a weight and a consequence that both of them feel. She began the demonstration. She started slow and precise, the way good instructors always start, building the foundation before the structure, making sure the audience understood each principle before she applied it. She walked through the mechanics of force redirection with a different training partner, first a younger SEAL named Torres, who was in on the instructional design and moved through the scenarios with clean cooperative precision. The crowd watched, nodded, asked questions when she invited them. Then she moved to the second principle, momentum capture. "Momentum capture," she said, turning to face the full room, "works on a simple physical truth. When an attacker commits to a direction, their own force becomes your asset. The greater their initial power, the greater the resource available to you." She paused. "This is counterintuitive. Most people, when hit with significant force, try to resist it, to push back against it. That is almost always the wrong response. The right response is to use it." She demonstrated the principle twice with Torres, smoothly, efficiently, with the kind of clarity that comes from having done something 10,000 times until it lives in the body rather than the mind. Then she looked at Victor Hayes. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," she said, "I'd like to demonstrate this principle at full speed with full commitment from my partner so that the audience can see the technique under realistic force conditions rather than cooperative conditions. Are you willing to give me a full speed, full commitment push scenario?" The room went so quiet that the ventilation system sounded like wind. Victor Hayes looked at her. He understood what she was asking. He understood the scenario she was setting up. He was not a stupid man. He could see the shape of the thing, the principle she had just explained, the scenario she was about to demonstrate, the very specific type of technique that full speed, full commitment push scenario was going to call for. He could see it. He stepped forward anyway. "Full commitment," he confirmed, and the room exhaled. Sarah nodded once. They moved to the far end of the mat. She positioned herself facing away from him at the edge, the same relative orientation as the trench. The positioning was exact, and everyone in the room recognized it the moment it was established. You could feel the recognition move through the crowd like a current, 117 people simultaneously understanding that what they were about to see was not an abstract demonstration of principle, but a direct, precise, formally staged recreation of Monday morning at the training trench. She had never said so. She had never named it. She didn't need to. Victor Hayes stood behind her, and felt the positioning and felt the recognition moving through the crowd, and for the first time, for the very first time in 22 days, something close to doubt moved across his face, just briefly, just for a second. Not doubt about his strength or his ability or his 30 years. Doubt about the architecture of the moment he was standing inside. Doubt about whether the room he thought he was in was actually the room he was in. Dominguez, sitting in the fourth row, saw it. He sat forward by about a centimeter, almost without meaning to. Reyes, 3 seats away, saw it too. "Ready?" Sarah said, her back to Hayes, her voice neutral and completely controlled. Victor set his jaw. 30 years of muscle memory took over. He was going to commit. He was going to give her the scenario she asked for. He was going to demonstrate in front of 117 people, including a brigadier general, that he was a professional who could participate in a training demonstration with full effort and appropriate conduct. And he was also, in a part of himself he would not have admitted to under any circumstances, going to show everyone in this room exactly what had happened at the trench, because he still believed, he could not stop believing, that when it played out again, it was going to play out the same way. He didn't know. He genuinely did not know what was coming. "Commit on your ready," Sarah said. He launched forward. What happened in the next 3 seconds was not chaos. It was its opposite. It was precision so complete that it looked to the untrained eye almost slow, almost gentle, almost inevitable. The way things that have been prepared for at the highest level always look when they finally occur, because the preparation has removed everything except the essential movement. And the essential movement has been made so many times that it no longer requires effort, only execution. She dropped. She redirected. She captured. She swept. And Victor Hayes, 230 pounds of 30-year Marine veteran, went from vertical to horizontal in less time than it takes to say his name hitting the mat, with a sound that was not dramatic and was not theatrical, and was just the straightforward sound of a large person making contact with a padded surface at a speed that did not give them any choice in the matter. He was pinned, completely, technically, irrevocably pinned. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. Sarah counted them. She counted them because she had learned over 18 years that the silence immediately after something significant happens is not empty. It is full of the work people are doing to understand what they just saw, and interrupting that work too quickly produces confusion instead of clarity. 4 seconds. Then she stood up and stepped back, and Victor Hayes lay on the mat for one additional moment, not because he was hurt, because he wasn't. She had executed the technique with controlled precision, but because he needed that moment to process the fact of what had just happened to him in front of 117 people on a mat that he had walked onto, believing the outcome was already decided. He got up. He got up the way men get up when they are rearranging something fundamental inside themselves, while trying to maintain the exterior presentation that suggests no rearranging is necessary. His face was controlled. His body was controlled. But his eyes were different than they had been 60 seconds ago. Something in them had shifted in a way that could not be unshifted. Brigadier General Holt in the 3rd row uncrossed his arms. Commander Okafor beside him made a small sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word, but communicated something very specific. Sarah turned to face the full room. She did not look at Hayes. She addressed the audience. "What you just saw," she said, "is the direct application of the 3 principles we discussed: force redirection, momentum capture, positional control under physical disadvantage." Her voice was the same as it had been at the beginning of the demonstration. Level, professional, precise, not triumphant. "The size differential between myself and Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes is approximately 98 pounds. The speed and force of his commitment was full. The outcome was not determined by strength. It was determined by preparation timing and the use of the attacker's own energy." She paused. "In a combat environment," she said, "this distinction is the difference between living and not living." A hand went up in the 2nd row. It was a young Marine, one of the participants, a woman named Brennan McKenzie. Brennan, 26 years old, 3 months into the program, sharp and quiet, and always in the first third of the group on every physical assessment. Sarah had noticed her on day 2, and had been watching her with quiet attention ever since. "Commander," Brennan said, "can you walk through the mechanics of the first movement, the drop? I want to understand exactly what happens in that moment. Something about the question, the specificity of it, the confidence of it, the fact that it came from a young woman who had just watched a female commander pin a male veteran twice her size and was immediately asking how to learn it moved through the room like a different kind of current than the one that had moved through it before. "Absolutely," Sarah said. "Come up here." Brennan came up, and for the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked her through the mechanics, step by step, patient and exacting and generous with the detail. Brennan was a fast learner. She moved well. By the end, she had the basic sequence down well enough that she attempted a slow-motion version of it on Torres and hit the critical angles on her second try. The room watched Mackenzie Brennan. Then, without any prompting, without any arrangement, something happened that Sarah had not planned and could not have planned. A second woman, a SEAL petty officer. Second-class Yates, who had been sitting in the back and had said almost nothing in 3 weeks of the program, stood up and said, "Can I try that sequence?" And then it wasn't a demonstration anymore. It was a class. Victor Hayes stood at the edge of the mat through all of it. He did not leave. He could have left. There was no formal obligation requiring him to stay, but he didn't. He stood there and watched Mackenzie Brennan nail the entry angle on her third attempt and watched Petty Officer Yates work through the momentum capture with the focused intensity of someone who understands that they have just been shown something real and refuses to let the moment pass without taking it in completely. He stood there and something was happening in his face. Something that Reyes saw and Dominguez saw and Dawes saw and General Holt saw and Okafor saw and Sarah Mitchell, who was watching everything while appearing to watch only the technique, saw most clearly of all. Victor Hayes was beginning to understand what he had not understood. Not quickly, not completely, not with the clean, immediate clarity that made for a satisfying story. It was more complicated than that. It was the process, slow and uncomfortable and physically felt in the chest the way real reckonings are always physically felt of a man beginning to dismantle something he has built over a very long time. During a break in the session, Dominguez walked to where Victor was standing. They didn't look at each other at first. They stood side by side looking at the mat. "She knew," Dominguez said. Victor said nothing. "She's known since day one," Dominguez said. "Every move you made, she let it run because she was building something." He paused. "She was building this." Victor's jaw was tight. "I know that now." "What are you going to do with it?" A long pause. "I don't know yet." Dominguez nodded. That was, in his estimation, the most honest thing he had heard Victor Hayes say in 3 weeks. General Holt crossed the warehouse floor at the end of the session and stopped in front of Sarah. He was a tall man with the particular bearing of someone who has commanded people in situations where the margin for error was measured in human lives, and he stood in front of her now and looked at her with an expression that she could not quite categorize. "Commander Mitchell," he said. "General Holt," she said. "That was a hell of a demonstration." "Thank you, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The incident at the trench, the video." "Yes, sir. You planned this from the moment you stood up out of that mud, didn't you?" She met his eyes. "I planned it from the moment I received this command, sir. The incident at the trench accelerated the timeline." Holt looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He nodded. Once, slowly, with a weight behind it that communicated more than most speeches manage. "Carry on, Commander," he said. He walked back across the warehouse and said something to Okafor that made Okafor write immediately in his notebook. Sarah watched him go and then turned back to the mat where Mackenzie Brennan was running through the sequence again, on her own, quietly, carefully committing it to muscle memory, the way you commit things to muscle memory when you understand that what you've been given is not just a technique, but a truth. Sarah watched her for a moment, just a moment. Then she went to join her on the mat and show her the next step. Outside the warehouse in the corridor that ran along its eastern wall, Victor Hayes stood alone for 4 minutes. Reyes checked on him once quietly, and Victor waved him off without turning around. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and the weight of 30 years of certainty pressing down on him from the inside while the weight of the last 3 hours pressed down from the outside, and somewhere in the compressed space between those two forces, something was beginning, slowly, reluctantly, painfully to give. He hadn't lost a fight. That wasn't the point, and he understood it wasn't the point, which made it worse in some ways and better in others. He had walked onto that mat believing that physical superiority was the argument. He had discovered in 3 seconds that the argument had been settled before he arrived, and the person who had settled it had not been angry, had not been vindictive, had been from the first moment to the last simply excellent. He stood in that corridor for 4 minutes and then walked back into the warehouse and picked up a position against the near wall and watched the rest of the class. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to say anything. His presence back in that room was the loudest thing he'd said in 3 weeks. Sarah noticed him return. She didn't acknowledge it. She kept her attention on Brennan, on the technique, on the work. But she noted it the way she noted everything, precisely, completely, without letting it change the expression on her face. It was progress. It was not resolution. Resolution would take longer and be harder and require things from Victor Hayes that he hadn't yet decided he was willing to give. But he came back into the room. And in Sarah Mitchell's experience, the people who came back into the room were always the ones who were capable of becoming something different than what they had been. She filed that information in the same place she filed everything else, the steady, patient, accumulating record of what was true about the people around her, and turned back to the mat in the work. There was still so much work to do. The review board convened on Monday morning at 9 a.m. in Colonel Whitfield's conference room. It was not a large room. It held a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted screen, and a window that looked out onto the main parade ground. 7 people were seated when Sarah walked in. Whitfield, Okafor, the 2 officers from Naval Special Warfare Command, whose names were Commander Briggs and Lieutenant Commander Park. A JAG officer named Captain Ellison, who handled military legal matters with the specific kind of exhausted precision that comes from spending a career inside situations where the law and human behavior intersect badly. A Marine Corps representative named Major Torres, who was not related to the SEAL named Torres from the demonstration, and General Holt, who was at the head of the table in a chair that everyone in the room understood to be the head of the table, regardless of whose conference room it technically was. Victor Hayes was not in the room. He would be brought in separately. Sarah sat in the chair indicated across from Ellison and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and waited. Whitfield opened the session. He went through the formal structure, the nature of the review, the incident under consideration, the evidence on record. He read the date of the trench incident. He noted the presence of the cell phone footage, which had been formally entered into the record. He noted Commander Okafor's witness statement. He noted the formal training request, the subsequent demonstration, and General Holt's attendance. He did all of this with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that formal language was a container for difficult things and used it accordingly. When he finished, Holt spoke. "Commander Mitchell," the general said, "before we go further, I want to ask you something directly." "Sir," she said, "the demonstration on Saturday, the positioning you used, the specific scenario you structured around the push technique." He looked at her steadily. "That was deliberate recreation of the trench incident." It was not quite a question. "Yes, sir," she said. The room was very quiet. "Why?" Holt said. "You had grounds for a formal complaint from day one. You had grounds for disciplinary action against Hayes from the moment of the trench incident. You had a witness statement from a Naval Special Warfare evaluator who was present. You had video evidence. You could have filed a complaint that morning and had Hayes removed from the program by end of day." He paused. "Why didn't you?" Sarah looked at him. "Because removing him wasn't the point, sir." "Then what was the point?" "The point," she said, "was the room. Every person in that room Saturday morning carries an assumption about what leadership looks like, about what capability looks like, about what gender means in a combat context. Those assumptions don't change because of a complaint. They don't change because of a disciplinary action. They change," she stopped. "Organize the thought precisely. They change when the people who hold them see something that their assumptions cannot explain. When reality contradicts the assumption directly, visibly, in a way that cannot be rationalized away." Holt was quiet for a moment. "You used the incident as a teaching tool. I used it as an opportunity," she said. "The incident was his choice. What I did with it was mine." Another silence. Longer this time. Briggs and Park exchanged a look across the table. Ellison wrote something on her legal pad. Major Torres, the Marine representative, was looking at the table in front of him with an expression of careful neutrality. "The incident itself," Holt said. "What do you want to happen?" Sarah had known this question was coming. She had been thinking about her answer not for hours but for days since the morning she stood up out of the mud and watched Victor Hayes' face and understood that the simplest response and the right response were not the same thing. "I want accountability," she said, "and I want him to stay." The room reacted, not loudly but visibly. Briggs looked up. Park's pen stopped moving. Ellison's head came up from her legal pad. "Explain that," Holt said. "Hayes' conduct was indefensible," she said. "What he did at the trench was a deliberate physical assault on a commanding officer staged in front of witnesses and cameras designed to humiliate and undermine. That cannot go without formal consequence. It would set a standard that damages every future female officer who walks into a command role in this military." Her voice was steady and without heat. "So there has to be accountability. Real accountability on the record in his file, with formal consequences attached." She paused. "But he is also," she said, "one of the most capable combat instructors in this program. He has 30 years of knowledge that these younger operators need. And in the last 2 days since Saturday, I have watched him begin to do something that very few people are capable of doing after the age of 50. He is beginning to question a belief he has held his entire career. That process is uncomfortable and slow, and he is fighting it every step of the way." She looked at Holt directly. "If we remove him now, we stop that process. We take the lesson away from everyone who would have watched him complete it. And we send him somewhere else where he will continue to operate under the same belief system, but without any of the friction that is currently changing it." The silence that followed this was the longest silence the room had produced. Holt looked at her for a full 10 seconds without speaking. Then he looked down at the table. Then he looked back up. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you're describing is more work for you, more difficulty, more risk to your program." "Yes, sir." "You're choosing that deliberately." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for another long moment. "You're either," he said quietly, "the most professionally disciplined officer I've encountered in 40 years of service, or you are running a longer game than any of us have understood." "Both can be true, sir," she said. And for the first time, General Lawrence Holt smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was real. Victor Hayes was brought into the room at 10:15. He walked in with his chin level and his hands steady, and his face composed the posture of a man who has decided in advance that whatever happens next, his exterior will not betray his interior. He sat in the chair across from Whitfield and looked at the table, and then at the general, and then briefly at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him without expression. Whitfield went through the formal reading again, the incident, the evidence, the proceedings. Victor sat through it without moving. When Whitfield finished, Holt spoke. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, you are here because you physically assaulted a commanding officer. The evidence is not in dispute. The video is clear. Multiple witness statements corroborate it. Do you contest any part of that account?" A pause. "No, sir," Victor said. "Do you have anything you want to say?" Another pause, longer. Victor Hayes had spent 30 years knowing what to say in rooms like this. He had spent 30 years having the right answer ready, and now he sat in a chair in a room with a general and a JAG officer, and the woman he had shoved into a trench, and he did not have the right answer ready. For the first time in a very long time, he did not know what the right thing to say was. He said the only thing he could find that was true. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out rough. Not because he was emotional, because the words were heavy in a way he hadn't expected them to be. "What I did was wrong. Not wrong because of the consequence. Wrong because—" He stopped. His jaw worked. She had earned the command. She had earned everything she was given. And I couldn't see it because I had already decided what I was going to see. He stopped again. "That's not the kind of mistake a Marine makes. That's not who I am supposed to be." The room was completely still. Sarah looked at Victor Hayes and felt something that surprised her. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those. Something that was closer to recognition. The recognition of a person in the act of paying a real price for a real mistake and doing it honestly, which was the hardest way to do it. Holt spoke. He outlined the formal consequences, a letter of reprimand to be placed in Hayes' permanent file, a formal reduction in program authority. He would continue in the program, as Sarah had requested, but in a training instructor role rather than any leadership capacity. A mandatory review period of 60 days, at the end of which his status would be reassessed based on conduct and contribution. Commander Mitchell has requested that you remain in this program, Holt said. I want you to understand that clearly. She had the authority to end your career here this morning. She chose not to use it. Victor Hayes looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. Wow, he said. It came out like something that had been held for a long time and finally had to be released. She considered him for a moment, then she said simply, because the program needs what you know, and because the people who can change it are more valuable than the people who can't. He held her gaze. Something crossed his face that was difficult to name. It was the expression of a man who has been holding a weapon for 30 years and has just realized for the first time that he has been pointing it in the wrong direction. He nodded once, looked down. The review board adjourned at 11:40. People filtered out in ones and twos. Sarah was gathering her notes when Ellison, the JAG officer, stopped beside her. Off the record, Ellison said quietly. Go ahead, Sarah said. In 22 years of handling military legal proceedings, I have never seen a victim of command-level assault request the perpetrator's continued participation in the same program. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite confusion, something between the two. Most people would have buried him. Most people would have been right to, Sarah said. I'm not interested in burying him. I'm interested in what comes after. Ellison looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her legal pad and walked out. The week that followed was the strangest week the joint program had experienced. Not because it was turbulent, because it wasn't. Because the tension that had defined the first 3 weeks, the low-grade, constant, invisible static of a room full of people waiting to see who would win, was gone. And in its place was something that had no obvious name, but felt to the people inside the program like air after a storm. Like the particular quality of attention that comes into a room after something real has happened and people are still processing it. Victor Hayes reported to his first session as a training instructor on Tuesday morning. He was quieter than he had ever been in 3 weeks. He stood to the side during the main briefing. He spoke when he was called on and not otherwise. He demonstrated techniques with a precision that was undeniable, 30 years of knowledge moving through his hands and his body, with a fluency that no one in the room, regardless of what they thought of him personally, could look at and dismiss. And Mackenzie Brennan watched Claude's response was interrupted. Try again? Mackenzie Brennan watched Victor Hayes demonstrate a ground control sequence on Tuesday morning and wrote 3 pages of notes. Not because she was required to, because she could not afford to miss a single detail of what his hands were doing. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. The second thing she noticed was that Victor noticed it too. He was midway through a technique breakdown when he glanced at Brennan and saw her writing. Not casual note-taking, the focused, urgent writing of someone who understands they are in the presence of knowledge they cannot afford to lose. He paused, just briefly. Something in his face shifted, something small and involuntary, the way a person's face shifts when they receive unexpected information that requires a rapid internal adjustment. He finished the technique, moved to the next one. But twice more during that session, Sarah watched his eyes find Brennan in the group and stay there for a half-second longer than the general sweep of instruction required. He was seeing her. For the first time since the program began, Victor Hayes was actually seeing a young female operator not as a symbol of something he resented, but as a person who wanted what he knew. Sarah said nothing about it. She let it happen. By Thursday of that same week, something that nobody had formally organized had begun to take shape on its own. During the afternoon session, Brennan approached Hayes during a break with a specific technical question about entry angle in a corridor clearing scenario. It was a good question. It was the kind of question that came from someone who had been thinking carefully about a problem rather than someone performing the act of engagement. Hayes answered it, briefly at first, then in more detail when her follow-up question demonstrated she had understood his first answer and was ready for the next layer. By the end of the break, they had been talking for 11 minutes, and neither of them had noticed the time passing. Reyes saw it from across the room. He walked over to Dominguez and said quietly, "You seeing this?" Dominguez watched Hayes demonstrate a hand position adjustment to Brennan, who corrected her grip and immediately tried the movement again with the improvement incorporated. "Yeah," Dominguez said. 3 weeks ago, he would have said she didn't belong here. 3 weeks ago, Dominguez said, he would have been wrong then too. He's just starting to figure that out. Reyes shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, And the particular kind of wonder that comes from watching something you didn't believe was possible begin to happen in front of you. Sarah, across the room, watched Hayes watch Brennan nail the corrected technique on her second attempt. She watched the thing that crossed his face when Brennan got it right. It was not pride exactly. It was something adjacent to pride, the particular feeling of a teacher in the moment when the student demonstrates that the knowledge has transferred, that the thing you spent 30 years learning has successfully moved from your hands to theirs, that it will continue after you are gone. He had never felt that with a woman before. He had never let himself feel it. And now he was feeling it unwillingly and undeniably, standing in the middle of a program he had spent 3 weeks trying to undermine, being changed by it in a way he could not have predicted and could not stop. That was the twist that nobody had seen coming, not even Sarah entirely. She had planned for accountability. She had planned for the demonstration. She had planned for the review board and the formal consequences in the restructured role. She had not planned for Victor Hayes to become, within 2 weeks of the hardest moment of his professional life, one of the most genuinely invested instructors in the entire program. But she had hoped for it. She had chosen to leave the door open for it, and he had walked through it. The 60-day review period moved through November with a rhythm that felt different from the first weeks of the program. The static was gone. In its place was a particular kind of productive intensity that happens when a group of capable people are finally working in the same direction instead of around each other. Assessment scores climbed. Cross-branch collaboration, the original stated purpose of the entire program, the thing that had seemed almost abstract in the first troubled weeks, began to happen naturally without being engineered or mandated. SEALs and Marines ran scenarios together and built the kind of instinctive operational trust that usually takes years of shared deployment to develop. They developed it in weeks because the environment Sarah had built, despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, had given them a shared experience of something real. The incident, the demonstration, the review board, the visible and difficult transformation of the program's most resistant member, all of it had created a common story that the group lived inside together. And common stories are what make groups into teams. Corporal Dawes documented the assessment data with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood he was recording something historically significant. His reports went to Whitfield and Okafor, and upward from there, and the numbers in those reports made people in offices far from Camp Pendleton sit forward in their chairs. Commander Okafor called Sarah on a Wednesday evening in the 5th week of the review period. "The data from your program," he said without preamble, "is being discussed at the Naval Special Warfare Command level." "I heard," she said. She was in her quarters reviewing the next week's training schedule. "There's talk about using this as a model," Okafor said, "the cross-branch integration framework, the assessment methodology, possibly the command structure." She was quiet for a moment. The command structure meaning a female CO, meaning a performance-based selection standard that doesn't filter by gender before it filters by qualification. Which in practice would mean more female COs, so, she said, if the selection is genuinely merit-based. "Yes," Okafor said, "if." She heard what was behind that word, the work that word contained, the distance between a policy change on paper and an actual shift in the culture of an institution that had been built over 250 years by and for a specific kind of person. She heard all of that in one small word, and she did not minimize it. "It's a start," she said. "It's more than a start," Okafor said. 6 months ago, this conversation wasn't happening. She set down the training schedule. "How's Hayes' review tracking?" A brief pause. "Formally excellent. His instructor evaluations are among the highest in the program. Conduct is clean." Another pause. Informally, Okafor said, and she could hear something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but was in that neighborhood. "I had a junior officer tell me this week that Hayes is the reason she's reconsidering staying in the Corps past her initial commitment." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Which junior officer?" Brennan, Okafor said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Open them." "What did Hayes say about the program?" "Informally." "He said," Okafor paused as if checking a note. "He said, and I'm quoting directly here, 'I spent 30 years thinking I understood what makes a good operator. Turns out I was right about most of it and completely wrong about one part of it, and the part I was wrong about was the most important part." End quote. Sarah sat with that for a moment. He said that she said in front of 6 people, Okafor confirmed, voluntarily without being asked. She looked at the wall. She was quiet long enough that Okafor said her name once to check if she was still there. I'm here, she said. I was just thinking about something. What? That the most dangerous warriors, she said slowly, are often the ones you never expected. And the most powerful moments of change are usually the ones nobody planned. Okafor was quiet for a beat. You planned this one. I planned the structure, she said. I didn't plan him. The formal end-of-program ceremony took place on a Friday in the first week of December. All 47 original participants were present, along with Whitfield Okafor, both NSW officers, Major Torres and General Holt, who had flown in specifically, and whose presence communicated without any words being necessary the level at which this program had registered. Sarah stood at the front of the room and looked at 47 faces and thought about what they had been on the first morning she stood in this same position and what they were now, and understood that the distance between those two things was not something she could take credit for. She had created the conditions. They had done the work. What you built here, she said without notes, is not a training program. Training programs end when the final assessment is filed. What you built is a standard, a way of operating together that you will carry into every unit you join, every mission you lead, every operator you train after this. She paused. That doesn't end today. That's the point of today. When the formal portion concluded, General Holt asked to speak. He stood at the front of the room with the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years understanding what moments mattered and how to meet them. I have been in this military since before most of you were born, he said. I have watched it change in ways I welcomed, in ways I resisted, in ways I was wrong to resist. I want to say something today that I should have said publicly a long time ago. He looked around the room. The standard for combat leadership is performance. It has always been performance. When we allow anything else, rank structure, legacy, bias, gender background, to precede performance in our assessment of a leader, we are not protecting the institution. We are weakening it. He stopped. Commander Mitchell did not prove that women can lead. That was never in question, regardless of what some of us believed. What she proved is that performance is the only argument worth having, and she proved it in the most direct way possible, by performing. He looked at Sarah. Commander Mitchell, she met his eyes. The record, he said, will reflect what actually happened here. It was in its way the most significant thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks of significant things. Because the record was the thing. The record was what outlasted the moment. The record was what young officers would read in 10 years when they encountered the same resistance she had encountered and needed to know that someone had already walked that road and the road had led somewhere. After the ceremony, as people moved through the informal gathering that followed, Victor Hayes found Sarah near the edge of the room. He had been working up to this moment for several days. She could tell. She could see it in the slightly different quality of his stillness. Commander, he said. Gunny, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The old Victor Hayes would have used that silence to project authority. This Victor Hayes was using it to find the right words, which was a different thing entirely. I owe you more than an apology, he said finally. An apology it's the minimum. It's the floor. What I did to you wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It was... He stopped. Tried again. I looked at you and I decided what you were before I ever watched you work. And I spent 3 weeks trying to make everyone else see what I had decided instead of looking at what was actually in front of me. He shook his head once. That's not the Marine Corps. That's not who I was trained to be. And it's not who I'm going to be going forward. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. He blinked. How, Brennan, she said simply. Something moved across his face, something that was unmistakably shame. Not the hot shame of getting caught, but the deeper, quieter shame of understanding the gap between who you intended to be and what you actually did, and deciding that gap is not something you can live with. She's going to be extraordinary, he said quietly. She already is, Sarah said. You helped her see it. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer and more direct than any moment of genuine contact they had managed across the entire program. Then he nodded once, not the nod of subordination, the nod of one professional acknowledging another across the distance of everything that had happened between them, finding the solid ground on the other side. He walked away. She watched him go. Reyes appeared at her side a minute later. He had a cup of coffee and the expression of someone who had witnessed something they would tell people about for the rest of their life. "You okay, Commander?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she was. Not in the uncomplicated way that word usually implies. In the truer, more complex way, okay the way you are. Okay when something difficult and necessary has been completed, and the cost of it was real and the result was worth the cost. "What happens now?" Reyes asked. "For you," she said, "you go back to your unit and you carry what you learned here, and you make the next group of people you work with better because of it. And you," she looked at him, "I have a deployment." He nodded, looked at his coffee. "Will you come back to a program like this?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but someone will, and it'll be easier the next time because of what happened here." She paused. "That's the point of doing hard things the right way. You make it slightly less hard for the person who comes after you." Reyes thought about that. "Slightly," he said. "Slightly," she confirmed. "Nobody said it gets easy." He laughed. It was a real laugh, genuine and sudden, and it cut through the room the way real laughter cuts through rooms, like something breaking open that needed to break open. A few people nearby looked over and smiled without knowing why. 3 weeks after the program ended, a request came through official channels to formalize the Joint Training Framework as a permanent Naval Special Warfare and Marine Corps Raider Cross Branch curriculum. The request cited the Camp Pendleton pilot program explicitly. It named the assessment data. It named the cross-branch integration outcomes. It named Commander Sarah Mitchell as the architect of the framework. She was in the Indian Ocean when she read the request on a secured tablet. She read it twice, set the tablet down, picked it up and read it a third time. Then she set it down and looked at the horizon through the small porthole of her quarters on the ship. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt with a quiet completeness that was better than either of those things, that something had been planted in ground that had been resistant and difficult and had resisted every easy solution, and it had taken root anyway and it would grow, whether or not she was there to tend it. That was enough. That was more than enough. The framework was approved 6 weeks later. The first cohort of the formalized joint program began training in March at 2 locations simultaneously, Camp Pendleton and a second installation in Virginia Beach. The lead instructor selected for the Virginia Beach cohort was a decorated Marine veteran with 30 years of combat experience and a recently documented shift in professional philosophy that had been noted by 3 separate senior officers as one of the most significant examples of leadership growth they had encountered in recent command memory. His name was Victor Hayes. The first morning he stood in front of his new cohort in Virginia Beach, he did not give a speech about tradition or about the Corps or about what it meant to be a Marine. He stood in front of 41 operators, men and women, Navy and Marine, and he said 4 sentences. "My name is Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes. I am going to make you better than you think you can be. The standard in this program is performance. Everything else is noise." Then he started them on the obstacle course. The first person to finish by 11 seconds was a woman named Petty Officer First Class Diana Cho, who had never been in a program where those 4 sentences were the actual operating principle rather than a slogan posted on a wall. She crossed the finish line and looked at Hayes, and Hayes looked back at her and nodded once with the same directness he had given Sarah Mitchell across a room in December. Cho didn't know the history. She didn't know about the trench or the mud or the warehouse or the review board. She didn't know about the 4 minutes Victor Hayes had spent alone in a corridor rearranging something fundamental in himself. She didn't know any of it. She just knew that the man in charge of her program had looked at her crossing the finish line first and nodded like it was exactly what he expected. That was enough. That was the whole point. Back in the Indian Ocean, Sarah Mitchell ran 4 miles on the ship's deck at 5 in the morning and did not think about her program or her record or the framework that now carried her name in official naval documentation. She thought about the next mission. She thought about her team. She thought about the work that was directly in front of her, which was the only work that had ever mattered to her, which was the reason she had been doing this for 18 years and would keep doing it until her body told her otherwise. She was not a symbol. She was not a story. She was an operator who had a job to do, and the competence to do it, and the patience to let the truth of that competence speak for itself in whatever room she happened to be standing in, to whatever audience happened to be watching. The most dangerous warriors are often the ones who never need to announce who they are. They show up, they perform, they hold the standard when holding the standard is the most difficult thing in the room. And then they move on to the next thing because there is always a next thing, and the next thing is what matters now. Sarah Mitchell finished her run, stretched for 4 minutes, went below deck and got to work. The story of what she had built at Camp Pendleton would outlast her time there by years, then decades, spreading through every operator who had been in that room, every person who had watched the video, every young officer who would read the formal record and find in its careful language the evidence that someone had already walked this road and the road had led somewhere real. The truth, once it is made impossible to deny, does not require anyone to carry it. It carries itself. Mackenzie Brennan watched Victor Hayes demonstrate a ground control sequence on Tuesday morning and wrote 3 pages of notes without looking up once. Not because anyone required it, because in 11 years of wanting to be the kind of operator that people in rooms like this took seriously, she had learned to recognize the moments when the knowledge in front of her was the kind that did not come around twice. Hayes was midway through breaking down the second transition when he glanced at her. He saw the notebook. He saw her hand moving. He saw in the focused downward angle of her head the posture of someone who was not performing engagement, but actually inside it, actually taking the thing apart and putting it back together in her own mind while his hands were still demonstrating it. He paused, half a second, the kind of pause that nobody else in the room would have caught. Sarah caught it. She was standing to the left of the group, positioned where she could see both the instructor and the students simultaneously, which was where she always positioned herself and which most people never noticed. She saw Hayes pause. She saw where his eyes had gone. She saw the small, involuntary recalibration that moved across his face when he registered what Brennan's notebook meant. He finished the technique, moved to the next, but for the rest of that session, his eyes returned to Brennan 3 more times, not to check on her, not to assess her, but with the specific quality of attention that a person gives to something they are still in the process of understanding. He was seeing her not as a symbol, not as a political appointment or a diversity statistic or a test of something he resented. He was seeing a young operator who wanted what he knew, and that want was so clear and so genuine that it had cut through 30 years of assumption, the way sharp things cut through the material that blunts everything else. Sarah said nothing. She let it run. She had learned across 18 years of working in environments where the culture was always the hardest part of the job that the most durable changes never came from being told what to see. They came from seeing. And you could not engineer the moment of seeing. You could only create the conditions under which it became possible and then step back and give it room. She had created the conditions. Victor Hayes was doing the seeing. And Mackenzie Brennan, who had no idea any of this was happening around her, was simply being exactly what she was, which was, it turned out, exactly enough. By Thursday of the same week, something had begun that nobody had formally arranged. During the afternoon break, Brennan approached Hayes with a question about entry angle in a corridor clearing scenario. It was a precise question, the kind that only comes from someone who has been turning a problem over in their mind long enough to identify the exact place where their understanding stops and their confusion begins. Hayes answered it. Then she asked a follow-up. Then he answered that. Then she demonstrated the movement she had been trying to correct, and he adjusted her positioning by 2 degrees, and she ran the movement again, and it was different. It was noticeably, measurably, immediately different. Hayes looked at her for a moment after that. Then he said, "Do it again." She did it again. Did it. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they are admitting something to themselves rather than communicating to someone else. They had been talking for 14 minutes before either of them noticed. Reyes saw it from 20 feet away. He walked to Dominguez and said quietly enough that nobody else could hear, "You seeing this right now?" Dominguez watched Hayes show Brennan the next level of the same technique, watched her absorb it. "Yeah," he said, 3 weeks ago. "I know," Dominguez said. 3 weeks ago, he was the reason half the Marines in this program thought she didn't belong here." Dominguez was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks ago, he thought a lot of things that turned out not to be true. He watched Hayes watch Brennan nail the corrected angle on her 3rd attempt. Doesn't mean he can't learn. Reyes shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, in the particular wonder of watching something you had written off as impossible begin to happen in front of you in real time, refusing to stop just because you hadn't believed in it. Sarah crossed the room 15 minutes later and stood beside Hayes for a moment without speaking. They watched Brennan run the corridor clearing sequence in full speed with a training partner applying the corrected angle, and the difference was visible to anyone in the room who knew what they were looking at. "She's fast," Hayes said quietly, not to Sarah specifically, more to the air in front of him. "She's been fast since day 2, Sarah said. "You weren't watching yet." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. It was the second time in a week he had said those 2 words to her. "I know." Each time they carried a different weight. The first time they had been the admission of a man accepting a verdict. This time they were something else. The admission of a man accepting a truth that went beyond the specific situation and implicated something larger and older and more deeply held. Sarah let it be what it was. She didn't press it. She had learned that lesson from the mud, that some things, if you crowd them too quickly, collapse under the pressure of your attention. Some things need to find their own shape. She walked back to her position on the left side of the room and let Victor Hayes watch Mackenzie Brennan become something he had spent 3 weeks telling himself she couldn't be. The 60-day review period moved through November with a quality that everyone in the program felt but few could have named precisely. The static was gone. Not replaced by comfort exactly, this was still a demanding program with high standards and people who had been working at their limit for weeks. But the specific friction of a room divided against itself had dissolved, and in its absence, something that felt almost like clarity had taken its place. Assessment scores climbed. Cross-branch collaboration happened naturally without being mandated or engineered, because the common experience of the last several weeks had done what years of policy documents had failed to do. It had given SEALs and Marines a shared story, and shared stories build a kind of trust that transfers directly into operational effectiveness. You trust someone differently when you have been in the same room when something real happened, when you both know what it cost and what it produced. Corporal Dawes documented everything with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood he was close to something historically significant and did not want to get the details wrong. His reports went to Whitfield and Okafor, and from there to offices at Naval Special Warfare Command and Marine Corps headquarters, where people read the assessment numbers and sat forward in their chairs and made phone calls. Okafor called Sarah on a Wednesday evening in the 5th week of the review period. She was in her quarters reviewing training schedules for the following week. She answered on the second ring. "The data from your program," he said without greeting, "is generating significant attention at the command level." "I heard some of that," she said. "There is a formal proposal being drafted." Okafor said to use the Camp Pendleton Integration Framework as the basis for a permanent joint training curriculum. Cross-branch, expanding to multiple installations. She was quiet for a moment. "How formal?" "General Holt's office originated it," Okafor said. She set down her pen. "That's formal." "It names you as the architect of the framework," Okafor said. "By name, in the official document." She processed that, not with excitement. She had trained herself out of excitement about official recognition a long time ago, because excitement about recognition was a distraction from the work that generated the recognition, and she could not afford that distraction. She processed it the way she processed operational data. What does this mean? What does it require? What comes next? "How's Hayes tracking in the review?" she said. Okafor made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "You're not going to acknowledge what I just told you." "I acknowledged it," she said. "How's Hayes?" A pause. Then Okafor said, "Formally, his instructor evaluations are among the highest in the program. 3 of his students have shown the largest individual improvement gains in the cohort. Conduct is completely clean." Another pause. "Informally, I had a junior officer tell me 2 days ago that Hayes is the reason she's reconsidering her career plans." Sarah went still. "Which officer?" "Brennan," Okafor said. She was quiet for long enough that Okafor said her name. "I'm here," she said. "I was just taking that in." She told it to Hayes directly, Okafor said. She walked up to him after a session and told him that before this program, she had been planning to separate after her initial commitment because she was tired of being in environments where she had to fight for basic professional respect before she could even get to the work. She said that watching how this program changed was the first time she believed the institution was actually capable of becoming what it was supposed to be. The silence from Sarah's end lasted 4 full seconds. "And Hayes," she said, "what did he say?" He said Okafor read from what was clearly a written note. You stay. The Corps needs what you are. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Sarah closed her eyes, opened them, looked at the wall of her quarters with those calm, unblinking eyes that had looked at so many walls and so many quarters on so many bases across 18 years of doing this work. That's the twist, isn't it? Okafor said quietly. Not a question, an observation. What is, she said. He became the argument, Okafor said. You didn't have to make the argument. He became it. Victor Hayes, the man who shoved you into a trench, became the most credible voice in your program for why merit-based leadership is the only kind that works. A pause. Nobody could have planned that. No, she said, but you can create the conditions for it. Is that what you were doing the whole time? She thought about it honestly. I was doing what was right, she said. The conditions followed from that. The end of program ceremony took place on a Friday in the first week of December. 47 participants, all present. Whitfield and Okafor in the NSW officers, in Major Torres and General Holt, who had flown in again, whose presence alone told everyone in the room that what had been built here was being taken seriously at a level that extended well beyond Camp Pendleton. Sarah stood at the front and looked at 47 faces and understood that the distance between who they had been on day one and who they were today was not something she could accurately measure. Competence was measurable. Assessment scores were measurable. But what had actually changed in this room over the past weeks, the assumptions that had been examined and revised, the beliefs that had been tested against reality and found insufficient, the specific quality of trust that had formed between people who had started as representatives of competing institutions and had become something closer to a team that was not in any report Dawes had written, and it was worth more than anything that was. She said exactly that. She said it without notes in plain language, looking at the room directly the way she always did. When she finished, the applause was not the polite, formal kind. It was the kind that comes from people who mean it. General Holt stood and spoke. He said the things that needed to be said, and he said them with the authority of a man whose words would be repeated in military training context for decades. He talked about performance as the only legitimate standard of leadership. He talked about what happened when institutions allowed assumption to precede assessment. He talked about the cost of that error and the work required to correct it. And then he looked at Victor Hayes directly in front of everyone and said, the willingness to examine what you believe and change it when evidence demands, that is not weakness. That is the highest form of professional integrity. And this program produced an example of it that the institution should not waste. Hayes sat in his seat and received that in front of 47 people. His face was controlled, but his throat moved once and Dominguez sitting beside him noticed it and said nothing, because some moments are not for comment. After the formal portion, when the room had loosened into conversation and the institutional formality had given way to the more honest informality of people who had been through something together. Victor Hayes crossed the room and found Sarah near the far wall. She saw him coming. She waited. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and stood there for a moment with the particular stillnesses of a man who has something to say and is making sure he says it right. I need you to know something, he said. All right, she said. When I walked into this program, he said, I had a belief. It wasn't a small belief. It wasn't something on the surface. It was structural, built into the way I understood the job, the core, what all of this was for. He looked at her steadily. I used that belief as a weapon against you, not because you had failed, because my belief told me you were going to fail, and I couldn't tolerate being wrong about it, so I tried to make you fail. He stopped. His jaw was tight. That's what I actually did. I want to say it clearly because I've been finding ways to say it that make it sound smaller than it was. Sarah looked at him. She did not rush to fill the silence. What I did at the trench, he said, was the worst thing I've done in 30 years of service. Not because of the consequence to you, though. The consequence to you mattered because of what it said about who I had let myself become without realizing it. He held her gaze. You didn't just beat me on that mat. You showed me something about myself that I needed to see, and then you gave me the chance to do something with it instead of just destroying me with it. His voice was level. His eyes were not. I don't know that I deserved that. You didn't, Sarah said quietly, without cruelty. But Brennan did, and Reyes, and the 20 other people in this program who needed to see what happens when someone chooses growth over ego. She paused. I didn't do it for you, Victor. I did it for them. You just happened to be the one who had to do the work. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted into a configuration she hadn't seen from him before, simpler than what he usually wore, stripped down to something more honest. She's going to be one of the best, he said, meaning Brennan. She already is, Sarah said. You helped her see it. He nodded, looked away briefly, looked back. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making that mean something. I know, she said. And she did know. She knew it the way she knew things that were true, not because she wanted them to be true, not because it made the story cleaner, but because she had been watching Victor Hayes for 8 weeks, and she understood the architecture of the man. When he committed entirely. He had committed entirely to the wrong thing for the first 3 weeks of this program. He would now commit entirely to the right thing for whatever years he had left. That was not consolation. That was simply what he was. 3 weeks after the program ended, the formal proposal to create a permanent joint training curriculum arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command and Marine Corps headquarters simultaneously. It was approved within 10 days, which was by any institutional standard essentially immediate, a speed that communicated the level of support it had gathered and the clarity of the case made by the Camp Pendleton data. The framework was named the Integrated Operator Development Program. The founding documentation cited Commander Sarah Mitchell as lead architect. The selection standard written into the framework's core principles was 4 words: performance above all else. Sarah was in the Indian Ocean when Okafor sent her the notification. She read it on a secured tablet at 5:40 in the morning between her run and her first operational brief of the day. She read it twice, set the tablet down, looked at the porthole for exactly the amount of time it took her to absorb what it meant, not the recognition, not the naming, but the fact of it, the institutional permanence of it. The knowledge that what had been built under the most difficult possible conditions had been deemed worth building again and again and again in every place that needed it. Then she set the tablet down and went to her brief. The first cohort of the formalized program began in March. 2 locations, Camp Pendleton and Virginia Beach. The lead instructor selected for Virginia Beach had 30 years in the Marine Corps, 3 combat deployments to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, an official letter of reprimand in his permanent file, and a letter of commendation from Commander Sarah Mitchell submitted 6 weeks after the end of the Camp Pendleton pilot. Noting his exceptional contribution to the program's outcomes and his demonstration of the kind of professional growth that the institution should actively cultivate rather than discharge. The commendation had surprised everyone who knew the history. It had surprised Victor Hayes most of all. He had called Sarah when he received notification of it. She was between missions. She answered. You didn't have to do this, he said. It was accurate, she said. I don't file inaccurate reports. A long pause. Sarah. It was the first time he had used her name. Not commander, not ma'am, her name. Victor, she said. Thank you, he said. Just that. Nothing more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said, and after 30 years of military service, he knew the difference between words that added something and words that were noise. Go build something, she said, and hung up. The first morning Victor Hayes stood in front of his Virginia Beach cohort, he did not speak about tradition. He did not speak about the Corps or about what it meant to wear the uniform. He stood in front of 41 operators, men and women, Navy and Marine, and he said exactly 4 sentences. My name is Master Gunnery Sergeant Hayes. I am going to make you better than you think you can be. The standard in this program is performance. Everything else is noise. The first person to finish the opening course, run by 11 seconds, was Petty Officer First Class Diana Cho. She crossed the line and looked at Hayes, and Hayes looked at her and nodded once directly, immediately, without qualification or hesitation. The same nod he had given Sarah Mitchell across a conference room in December after the longest reckoning of his professional life. Cho didn't know that history. She didn't know about the trench or the mud or the mat or the 4 minutes a man had spent alone in a corridor dismantling 30 years of belief, because reality had finally made the cost of that belief too high to keep paying. She didn't know any of it. She just knew that she had finished first, and the man in charge had looked at her like that was exactly what he expected. Which was entirely the point, the whole point, the only point that had ever mattered. Back in the Indian Ocean, Sarah Mitchell ran her 4 miles and did her work, and thought about the mission in front of her and not the one behind her, because the mission in front of her was where the work was, and the work was what she had always been. She was not a symbol. Symbols are passive. She was an operator. She was a commander. She was a woman who had stood up out of the mud in front of 19 witnesses and continued her sentence, not because it was dramatic, not because she was making a point, but because the sentence needed to be finished, and she was the one responsible for finishing it. That was all it had ever been. Responsibility to the standard, faithfulness to the work, the refusal, absolute and unwavering and entirely without performance, to let anyone else's belief about her become her belief about herself. The truth does not require a champion. It requires only the patience to be demonstrated clearly and completely until it becomes impossible to deny. Sarah Mitchell had that patience. She had always had it. And everything that had followed the framework, the program and the changed minds, the young women who would now walk into rooms that were slightly less hostile because of what had happened in a training warehouse on a Saturday morning in October, all of it had followed, not from strategy, not from anger, not from the desire to prove something to anyone. It had followed from excellence, held faithfully in the mud, and out of it until the truth became the only thing left standing.